But tonight our topic is the Central Intelligence Agency, Challenges of the Next Decade. A wonderful topic, enormously important with respect to the future of that agency, but also the practice of American foreign policy. But the dimensions of that problem will be Mr. Smith's to present. Let me merely present him to you. He's had a very interesting set of experiences in government, a diverse and interesting set of experiences. Mr. Smith is a graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point. His law degree is from the University of Michigan. His experience in the Army included being legal advisor to the Deputy Chief of the Deputy Undersecretary of the Army. He also, I believe, was the Army's Counsel, or the Pentagon's Counsel, during the Panama Canal negotiations. For a decade, he worked as a legal advisor in the Department of State, largely on law enforcement and intelligence matters. He worked for a number of years with the United States Senate, serving as its general counsel, the general counsel to the Armed Services Committee. He also was the senior foreign policy staff member of that committee. He was Sam Nunn's designee to the Iran-Contra Committee and also to the Select Committee on Intelligence. And then with the law firm of Arnold and Porter, he had the opportunity to be head of the transition team at the Defense Department on behalf of President-elect Clinton. And he was appointed to head a joint commission on intelligence by Mr. Aspen and Mr. Woolsey, and now holds the important position of general counsel in the agency. Newspaper reports say that when he was given this job, his mission was to make sure the agency lived within the law, of course, that it worked well with the CIA, and that it wasn't mired down in archaic notions of the Cold War. But he can tell you all about that. I think it's a most interesting topic. The Central Intelligence Agency, Challenges for the Next Decade. It's my great pleasure to present Mr. Jeffrey Smith.
Thank you, Frank, very much. I will certainly lean forward in part because most of my time in my current job is spent leaning backwards, trying to avoid various shots taken at me. I hope all of you can hear me. I will try to keep the microphone strategically placed. I am delighted to be here this evening and am very impressed with this turnout. I hope I will not disappoint you by being too arcane in talking about the nuances of the intelligence business. I note that many of my remarks this evening will be drawn from the talk that John Deutsch gave at the National Press Club on Tuesday of this week. And John thought that his remarks went very well. This was the first time he had rolled out his strategic plan for CIA. And he said to his press guy on the way back to the agency, "Boy, I thought that went real well, don't you?" And the press guy said, "Yes, I thought so." And John said, "Everybody seemed like they really liked it and had a lot of good questions." And the press fellow said, "Yes." And John knew something wasn't quite right. And he said, "What's the matter?" And Dennis Bach said, "Well, a lot of people fell asleep." So... And even when my secretary typed my remarks, she said, "You know, you really ought to put some jokes in this. It's pretty dry." So this is not particularly funny, but I'll try to at least make it as informative as possible. John Deutsch, I must tell you, you had invited John to be here, but he has a number of conflicts and simply couldn't make it, and so I'm rather a poor substitute, but please bear with me. I know also that many of you are familiar with the intelligence community and the challenges that confront us in the wake of the Cold War. And an occasion like this is particularly useful because it gives all of us a chance to reflect a bit on where the intelligence community has been and where it must go if it is to continue as a key contributor to our national security. I know that many of you know the origins of the CIA, how it grew out of the OSS at the end of World War II. And there was a recognition in government that the United States needed a permanent civilian intelligence agency that was not subordinate to either the Department of State or the Department of Defense. You may also know the history of its early days and its successes, including the U-2 flights and the development of satellites. And recently, the agency has begun to declassify a substantial amount of our earlier material, and it has caused considerable interest. One fascinating example is the recent declassification of the Venona papers, the cracking of the KGB code that occurred just after World War II and led to some extraordinary counterintelligence successes, including information about how the Russians found out about the atomic bomb and the hydrogen bomb. The secret of the cracking of those codes was kept for over 40 years, and a new batch of those documents will be released shortly. Another example involves the release of the Corona files, our earliest satellite imagery. In both Venona and Corona, historians will have a wealth of material that will enable them to have a much better understanding of the major national security issues of the day. This is part of a program that goes back really to Bob Gates when he was the director of Central Intelligence, to try to declassify as much information as possible and get it out for public consumption. We really overclassify things in the first place, and we certainly keep them classified much too long. So that's an effort that takes a long time, but has to be done. Regrettably, in addition to successes such as Venona and Corona, CIA developed a culture in the 1950s and 60s in which some in the agency saw themselves as not being accountable to the law. For example, in the excellent recent biography of Allen Dulles called Gentleman's Spy, which I commend to you, Peter Gross tells the story that when then-director Dulles learned that an agency contract employee had leapt to his death in New York shortly after being administered LSD without his knowledge, as part of an agency experience, Dulles covered up the whole matter. The only disciplinary actions he took were oral reprimands to 2 officers, which Dulles then ordered not be included in their permanent agency records. Misadventures such as these came tumbling into public view in the mid-1970s with the Church and Pike committees. Those committees proposed a series of dramatic reforms, including establishment of permanent oversight committees in Congress. A whole new body of law was developed to regulate intelligence activities, a first in the world of intelligence and a first in the world. Those reforms, enacted during the late 1970s, were put to a test by the Iran controversy in the mid-1980s. Subsequent crises such as Guatemala and the BCCI and BNL problems have renewed concerns by some in Congress as to whether or not the CIA is properly functioning and whether it is capable of telling the truth to Congress. On top of this, the arrest of Aldrich Ames has been a terrible blow to the CIA. The damage he caused was enormous. As you may have seen in the press, we are just completing a damage assessment of the Ames matter, which we will be reporting to Congress shortly. It may simply be that large sections of the American public are not comfortable with secret agencies and the nature of intelligence work. But we live in an extraordinarily dangerous world. The requirements for intelligence collection and analysis have, in many respects, never been greater. More than ever before, policy makers require timely, accurate, and objective intelligence. In particular, intelligence analysis simply cannot be subordinate to policy concerns. Thus, the original idea underlying the creation of the CIA remains valid. This nation faces a vast range of challenges that will test our leaders in the post-Cold War world. These include things that you know very well: the activities of rogue states such as Iran and Iraq, the rise of a more sophisticated and more deadly kind of terrorist, the increasing power and global influence of organized crime and organized criminals and narco-traffickers, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, threats to our nation's economic security, and the continued violence and instability in the former Soviet Union. This latter point was emphatically underscored yesterday with a rocket attack on our embassy in Moscow. The irony is that such an event would have been unthinkable during the Cold War. We must also keep an eye on the larger, longer-term developments. For example, will an emergent China redraw the political and economic landscape of Asia? Will Russia abandon its steps toward democracy and return to authoritarian rule? Given the demands for intelligence and the sharp public criticism of the agency, fundamental questions about CIA are being asked that have not been raised since 1947 when the agency was formed. In many ways, the CIA must reinvent itself, much as the military did after the Vietnam War. The new director is well aware of this challenge. When President Clinton asked John to be the DCI, the Director of Central Intelligence, or DCI in Washington parlance, he instructed him to make whatever changes are necessary to ensure that our nation has the best intelligence service in the world and that we carry out our tasks with integrity. The director and his new team has now had an opportunity to develop a strategy for change. He set out that strategy for the first time in a speech this past Tuesday at the National Press Club, and that's the one in which he put several people to sleep. And since I learned a long time ago that it's not a good idea to either upstage nor disagree with your boss, let me summarize the thrust of his remarks. He said that two challenges face the intelligence community today. They are, first, to be effective, and second, to be accountable. These changes, which I'll discuss in a moment, will not be quick fixes. They will not involve massive new legislation or reorganization. Rather, they are designed to lay a foundation for the fundamental changes that are necessary in the intelligence community. If implemented, they will, I believe, accomplish the reinvention of CIA that is needed. I want to be clear that there is wide agreement within the CIA that change is needed. Indeed, we are finding great support for these changes. There are a great many things that the intelligence community does very well. We intend to build on these strengths. But we are also determined to address the very real problems that have damaged our reputation and diminished our effectiveness. The public must understand what we are doing. The President and the DCI are determined that intelligence activities be carried out in a manner consistent with our nation's values and interests. This process of reform and change will be open for discussion, and hence visits like mine this evening. And we welcome, by the way, the discussion that I hope will follow this, because I think it'll be illuminating for you and hopefully for all of us. Let me now summarize the 5 basic changes which the director has announced. First, we want to emphasize our customer focus. And by customer, we mean getting the right information to the right desk or the right commander at the right time. If we want our products to be read and relied upon, we must know exactly what information policymakers need and when they need it. And we must maintain an unassailable reputation for objectivity. Any effort to tailor analysis to policy will quickly destroy our credibility. We must change the way we get that job done. We still have trouble getting timely intelligence to military commanders in the field. I visited a friend of mine who is now a division commander. The idea that my classmates can actually be division commanders astounds me, but it's true. And I visited one at the Army's National Training Center in the desert in California, an extraordinary place, this past December. And we were standing on a ridgeline very early in the morning watching these massive maneuvers, which were fascinating. And he said to me, "You know, I've got one really big problem." And I said, "What's that, Bob?" And he said, "Well, I'm still trying to, if I need to find out what is on the other side of that ridgeline, I have to do it the way Custer did it. I have to send a scout out who, climbs up on top of the hill and looks down there, because I don't have anything that can take a picture and get it back to me, or take an image and get it back to me instantly. And the problem is, we can get it to the corps commander, or we can get it to the brigade commander, but we can't get it to the guy on the ground who really needs it." However, we have already started to improve our customer focus. We have recently gotten very high marks for support to humanitarian operations in Bosnia, Haiti, and Somalia. For example, interagency intelligence teams have been particularly effective in providing critical around-the-clock support, from detailed maps of remote areas to human intelligence, imagery, and personnel. All right, sorry, I'll try it again. You probably didn't miss much. Permanent interdisciplinary centers that bring together collectors and analysts from CIA and the other agencies have also been the most successful approach to such problems as weapons proliferation, organized crime, drug trafficking, and terrorism. In order to foster this improved customer focus, the DCI is meeting more often with our key customers, including the President and other cabinet officers. And to further sharpen this customer focus, there are two additional major steps underway. First, the Department of Defense and the intelligence community are working together to establish a joint space management board. Its job will be to ensure that we do not buy expensive new satellites unless there is a genuine demand from our customers. Secondly, we are in the process of creating a single national imagery agency, which will pull together all aspects of collection, analysis, and distribution of imagery. And by that we mean photographs from satellites and aircraft and other sorts of images collected from remote platforms. The goal is to provide military commanders timely all-source intelligence on the battlefield and to support diplomacy in peacetime. These initiatives will also save money by cutting headquarters staffs and vastly improving service. The next area of basic change concerns CIA's Directorate of Operations, or the DO. Even in these days of highly sophisticated technical collection, old-fashioned spying often provides the best information. This is particularly true with regard to such hard targets as rogue states or terrorists. It is also the most dangerous and to some unsavory method of intelligence collection. Human intelligence must be used selectively and effectively. There must be guidelines to ensure that the information we are seeking and the activities we are conducting are in pursuit of agreed-upon policies and are coordinated with our ambassadors in host countries. The new Deputy Director of Operations has ordered a complete scrub of all DO assets, as the intelligence community refers to its human agents. This is a unique and rigorous evaluation of each of the agents we recruit and pay to give us information. If the information these assets provide is no longer relevant, if we can get the same information elsewhere, or if questions of human rights violations or criminal involvement regarding the asset outweigh the value of the information provided, then we will end our relationship to that individual. At the direction of the DCI, I am drafting those guidelines to ensure that concerns about human rights and criminal violations are taken into account in recruiting, evaluating, and reporting on these assets. I never thought, by the way, that I would be in the business of writing job descriptions for spies. This process will also give us a way to provide more accurate and timely information to congressional oversight committees, which has been a problem in the past, and to law enforcement agencies. But I wish to emphasize that they do not mean we will slacken our efforts to recruit informants in hostile governments, terrorist organizations, or international crime and drug trafficking organizations. We must continue to work with some people with whom you might not like to have dinner, but it is the only way we can do our job effectively. The director also spoke about his concept of covert action. Since the public controversies over Iran-Contra and activities in Central America, we have greatly reduced our capability to engage in covert action. However, the United States must maintain and perhaps even expand covert action as a policy tool. The United States will undertake covert action only to support policy objectives agreed upon at the highest level of the government, and only then if the President authorizes such action after a scrupulous review, including timely notification of the appropriate congressional oversight committees. Finally, the Ames case taught us that counterintelligence must be a constant part of our operations. Recently, the DCI created a new position, the Associate Deputy Director of Operations for Counterintelligence, to ensure permanent high-level attention to these issues. We will continue to introduce new measures and improve existing procedures to ensure personnel security. We cannot relax our vigilance. I must add that our cooperation with in this area with the FBI is excellent. That has been the subject of considerable controversy in the past, but much progress has been made. And in fact, tomorrow, John Deutsch is having lunch with Judge Free. Part of a routine exchange, we're also exchanging officers between the FBI and the CIA. Like the Army and the Navy, we have to learn to work together. The third area of basic change is the need to greatly increase our cooperation with the law enforcement community. Cooperation between intelligence and law enforcement can produce fantastic results. The arrest of the leaders of the Cali cartel is the most recent example. However, President Clinton and Vice President Gore are not satisfied, and correctly so, that we have the necessary interagency mechanisms to address these threats adequately, particularly outside the United States, where agencies have a way of tripping over one another. We cannot afford to waste any further time with bureaucratic rivalries that go back to the days of J. Edgar Hoover and Allen Dulles. The intelligence community must learn that the key elements of the law enforcement community, FBI, DEA, and Customs, are just as much customers for our intelligence as are the Departments of State and Defense. Let me stress, however, that this does not mean that intelligence agencies will spy on U.S. citizens. Our collection activities will not infringe on the rights of U.S. citizens, nor will C.I.A. take on any law enforcement duties. We are prohibited from doing so by law. We in the Justice Department are simply trying to build a better partnership that will improve the country's performance in curbing international crime, drugs, and terrorism. The fourth area of basic change involves the need for integrated resource planning and programming for all agencies within the intelligence community. We face tight budgets, and the intelligence community is not immune from that. Indeed, the community has recognized the need for downsizing and is well on its way to a 23% cut in personnel over this decade. However, the intelligence community must develop a systematic planning, programming, and budgeting process to ensure that its budgets and programs are carefully reviewed by the DCI and his staff, so that resource-saving trade-offs, for example, the possibility of substituting satellites for aircraft imagery, is rationalized. The DCI sees this as an area to make a symphony from the various agencies. This is a tough and boring challenge, except within the bureaucracy where it involves great bloodletting, but it has to be done. The fifth and final area of basic change is to improve the quality of the people within the intelligence community. The DCI correctly believes that people are the most important element of success. Historically, the intelligence community has attracted outstanding and highly motivated individuals. Unfortunately, some parts of the intelligence community are in great danger of losing the ability to attract and retain those people. And this is particularly true in the case of the CIA Directorate of Operations. That must change. We must replace the CIA personnel system with one that is better suited to the unique work that the employees must perform. We must re-examine the use of the polygraph, or a lie detector, in hiring. We must create a system that both encourages employees to gain wider experience within the agency and discourages the development of barriers among the directorates within the CIA. The DCI has asked the CIA Executive Director to design a completely new system, and that process has begun. It will not be easy, but as we all recognize, the heart of any organization is its people. Let me now talk very briefly about my own role in this process. I was happily ensconced at Arnold & Porter last May when John Deutsch called me up and said, "All right, Smith, if I'm going out there, you're going with me." And I thought about it for a little while and thought that this was an opportunity to serve this director in this agency at this time was something that I should do. And so I signed on. And although this is my first opportunity to serve within the intelligence community, it has been my privilege to work very closely with it for nearly all of my 23 years in Washington. Dean Rusk once said that the legal advisor, as the general counsel at the Department of State is known, was the conscience of the department. That is the role I hope to fill at the CIA. I believe the most important value the intelligence community must embrace is integrity, both personal and professional integrity. We operate in a world of deception. It is our job to keep this nation's secrets secret and to obtain the secrets of other nations. We engage in deception to do our job, and we confront deception undertaken by others. To obtain the secrets of other governments, we must sometimes engage in deception of our own. But we must never let deception become a way of life. We must never deceive ourselves. Indeed, perhaps more than any other government agency, we in the CIA must have the highest standards of personal and professional integrity. We must be able to engage in deceptive activities directed toward others, but at the same time maintain scrupulous honesty in our dealings with ourselves and our customers. We must not let the need for secrecy obscure the honest and accurate presentation of the intelligence we have collected or the analysis we have produced. I believe that our professional integrity must be grounded in personal integrity of the highest order. In making promotion decisions and taking other personnel actions in the CIA, this DCI will demand the highest standards of personal integrity. In his novel, The Heart of Darkness, Conrad wrote of the need for moral ballast. And if we are to do our job as the American people demand, each and every officer of the intelligence community must make absolutely certain that his or her moral ballast assures that they will sail with a true compass. It's with these precepts in mind that I'm drafting the guidelines that will govern our relationship with human assets. I've also been reviewing many covert operations and am engaged in redefining our relationship with the law enforcement community. I've also been working with the executive director to revamp the personnel system. Let me add that I have been enormously impressed with the office of the General Counsel and the caliber of its lawyers. The quality of the lawyers is exceptionally high, on par with the best of other government law offices. Every major law school is represented. We have a wide and diverse pool of attorneys from both government and private practice. I'm honored to be the General Counsel, and I am honored also to be part of this extraordinary effort to assist the CIA and the intelligence community face the changes and the challenges that lie ahead. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward very much to the questions and answers. Thank you. It's a little hard, sir. The question was from Mr. Wu that in the director's speech to the National Press Club and in my remarks tonight, I talked about the need to have covert action approved by the President, and how could that be when much of the activities of the CIA outside the United States were covert, particularly with respect to the collection. I perhaps should have made that distinction clear. Under the law, the collection of foreign intelligence, that is to say the recruiting of a spy or the placing of a bug or the tapping of a cable or the deployment of a satellite, does not require the President's approval unless, of course, it's extraordinarily sensitive. But covert action, that is to say those actions undertaken by the intelligence community to try to influence events, efforts to place propaganda, efforts to influence a particular government in a particular way, those require what's called a finding, in which the President has to find that the particular activity is important to national security, has to sign that piece of paper, and that has to then be reported to the Congress. So in those activities where we are trying to influence behavior, often referred to as dirty tricks, those do require presidential approval, but not the mere collection of intelligence. The President should not be burdened with that. It's just not a good use of his time. But certainly those activities where we're, as a friend of mine at the Department of State used to say, where we are trying to change the facts, those activities do require presidential approval. The question was to comment on two items that have been in the news. One is CIA activity in Honduras. And second, why it took the CIA so long to uncover Aldrich Ames. Let me take those, if I may, in reverse order. The failure of the intelligence community, in particular the CIA, of course, to discover Ames is scandalous. It's outrageous, and nobody feels that worse than the CIA. The truth of the matter is, it was not handled well. It was a failure of management. It was a failure of the personnel security system. It was a failure of Ames's colleagues. And the only thing I can tell you is that we are trying to put procedures in place to ensure that it does not happen again. Now, you know, spying is as old as mankind, and one can never be certain that there will not be another spy. But we are certainly doing everything we can to prevent it. It was disgraceful. I know of no other word. With respect to, I can go into more detail. The facts are quite well known. We simply should have caught him. He passed 2 polygraphs while working for the Russians. He drank heavily. He put the documents in a shopping bag and simply walked out the front door of the building. Just disgraceful. But there you are. All I can tell you is that I'm doing everything I can, and the director is doing everything he can to make sure that doesn't happen again. Certainly CIA employees are much more alert to that kind of behavior, and one hopes that these things will not happen, but you cannot be sure. With respect to Honduras, there have been a number of allegations about CIA having relationships with military organizations in Central America that were inappropriate. Guatemala, Honduras, Salvador. With respect to Honduras, there was an Inspector General report in 1988 that found no wrongdoing. However, in part as a result of a series of articles in the Baltimore Sun, the director has ordered a fresh look at that evidence by an independent team within the CIA, and that review is coming along. It's not finished yet. I wish it were, but it's coming along. But it raises very basic questions, in part which lead to the review the new procedures that I am drafting, where when we establish a relationship with a foreign intelligence service or an asset, as I call him, as we call him or her, that information about that intelligence service or that individual will be forwarded to headquarters so that an intelligent balancing can occur between the value of the information to be provided and the costs associated with doing business with that individual or that organization. It's not to say we won't stop doing it, but we'll make a more intelligent decision. Sir. Let me repeat the question and make sure I understand it and invite clarification. The question was that Ames certainly did enormous damage. However, given the 10 years between 1985 when he started to spy and 1995 and the collapse of the Soviet Union, how would the world have been different had Ames not existed? And I take it, sir, your question is essentially, so what? That had we not had spies, would the Soviet Union have not collapsed? Is that essentially your question? Or the question is to the extent to which Ames's activities truly damaged the national security. Well, in the first case, of course, a number of Russians who were spying for us were shot and killed. We lost all of that information. We also lost a lot of other technical collection activities that he disclosed to the Russians. So our ability to find out what the Russians were up to was greatly damaged. Now, there is a debate, and Roger Hilsman has a piece in the current edition of Foreign Affairs in which he argues that the CIA is no longer necessary because the information obtained by espionage simply isn't worth it, that we get equally as good information from Foreign Service reporting or from the press or from the government itself. That's a serious case and made by a very serious and greatly respected American. I don't happen to agree with him. I think we do get a lot of information still from human spies as well as from a technical collection. I mean, who is to say whether the Soviet Union would surely still have collapsed had we, even if we had no spies. However, we certainly had a much better idea of what the Russian military was up to in terms of its development, in terms of its plans. And indeed, one can make a pretty good case that the information that we had from our spies, as well as information that the Russians were able to collect from us, provided assurances that there would not be a nuclear first strike, that there would be, that there were no truly aggressive plans on the part of the Soviet Union to attack us. And in that sense, it contributed to the to stability. I hope that answers your question. I'm not sure that I followed it, but sir, in the front here. Well, I'm a believer in directness. The question is that the CIA basically has a dilemma. On the one hand, it is our job to lie and to create deceptions, and on the other hand, it is to collect information and report it truthfully. And I tried to discuss that in my remarks when I talked about deception and the influence it can have on an individual. I must say, one of the most difficult things to do as a human being must be to be a CIA case officer. If you take a very honest young man or woman at age 25, which is about when they come into the agency, and you then recruit and train them to recruit people to become traitors to their own country and to become spies for us, that requires the ability to manipulate, it requires the ability to lie, and that individual, that American case officer, then has to turn around the very next day and report truthfully to his government about what he's doing and about the information he has learned. And over 25 years or so of a career, the terrible demands on the human being to sort of flip back and forth from honesty to dishonesty, it requires a person of extraordinary balance. The broader question of should the CIA be out of that business, in other words, should it be simply our business to either collect information and pass it on, and it should be somebody else's business to lie, has been debated since the agency was created. A related question is, should the agency have the covert action role, that is to say, the attempt to try to influence behavior? You can make a strong case that they ought to be separated. The fact is that they're now all in one agency, and it's very difficult, I think, would be to separate them. But it's certainly a valid question. As you may know, the Congress passed a law last year establishing a commission, now chaired by former Secretary of Defense Harold Brown, to look at those very kinds of questions. And I think it's fair to say that's a question on the table. It's a good question. Sir. The question was, how did the United States and the United Nations miss the buildup of weapons of mass destruction by Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and how can the 5 changes that we are instituting change that, make it more effective? The answer is that Saddam Hussein was better than we thought he was, the truth of the matter. He is skillful at hiding things, but it's also fairly easy to do. I mean, picture Iraq. It's a closed society. It's a tribal society. The people closest to Saddam Hussein are people who come from his village. Very difficult to penetrate that matter, just as it's difficult to penetrate terrorist organizations or organized crime. Moreover, Iraq is a big place. He was able to build buildings and put roofs over them, and a satellite can't see through the roof of a building. He was able to conceal some things. If he shields all of his communications, if he's very careful, satellites and technical collection can only do so many things. We knew a lot, but we didn't know as much as we should have known. The first thing in John Deutsch's 5 changes was to sharpen customer focus. And the idea is to do just precisely that. To be perfectly frank, it is a lot more important for the United States to know what is going on in places like Iraq and Libya and Iran than it is in some of the other places where we have people and where, quite frankly, we've gotten in trouble. So I think the idea is to shift the focus and sharpen our focus to those areas where we really need them and concentrate on them. This is not going to happen overnight. Intelligence is not perfect. We will continue to miss things. I can't promise you that 5 years from now we'll know every time a sparrow falls, but we can do much better, and we must do better. The question is, what is a hard target, and are there any other kind of targets, like presumably soft targets? The answer is this is a intelligence community lingo. A hard target is, as the title suggests, those places and organizations that are particularly difficult to collect against. Iraq is a perfect example of a hard target. We used to speak of the Soviet Union as a hard target. Those places that are difficult to penetrate for a variety of reasons, or have very effective counterintelligence organizations, which mean that very difficult to mount either technical collection or human intelligence. Those are the hard targets. But we also do a lot of work against so-called softer targets, economic intelligence, projection of grain production in the Soviet Union, where a lot of information can be gathered from public sources, but some of our analysts, who are terribly smart people, very experienced, can assemble that data, analyze it, and make projections. It just is a much easier job to try to predict the crops in Russia than it is to predict whether the Russians are developing a new guidance system for a missile. The question was an excellent one. I wish I could repeat it in detail. It essentially said, quoted the part of my speech in which I talked about deception and the fact that we in the CIA use deception in order to do our job and in order to penetrate the deception of other governments. The one thing that you did misquote me, ma'am, is I never said that we must deceive our own government. That is unforgivable. However, we must sometimes deceive other governments, and we certainly must use deception to protect ourselves. The difficulty is the one that I alluded to in an answer to an earlier question about the difficulty that human beings face who operate in this world. And quite frankly, having worked in Congress for some time, there is great suspicion of the intelligence community. I happen to be in the, if you'll permit me to tell a brief story, I happened to be in the room in the Senate Intelligence Committee in 1986 when then Director Casey came up to testify about the initial disclosures in the Iran-Contra affair. You may recall that a news magazine in the Middle East published a story that the Americans were trading arms for hostages, and we were shipping things to Iran, and we were shipping weapons to Iran, anti-aircraft missiles in particular. President Reagan denied that, said it wasn't true. And so the Senate Intelligence Committee decided to have a hearing, and they were going to have Bill Casey, who was then the director, come up and testify. This was in, I think, about mid-November of '86. And Casey came up to the committee, and Senator Byrd, who was then the majority leader of the Senate and is a member ex officio of the committee, came to the hearing. It was a closed hearing in a secure room, and I was fortunate to be one of the few staff members permitted to attend the hearing. And Senator Byrd said to the chairman of the committee, you know, Mr. Chairman, we ought to put Director Casey under oath because this is a very important matter. And the chairman, then Senator Bourne, said, well, Mr. Leader, we really don't do that. We trust the director. It'd be, quite frankly, it'd be an insult to him to make him testify under oath. And Byrd said, well, this is your committee, but I really think we ought to put him under oath. And Casey said, oh, Mr. Chairman, I'll tell the truth, I'll tell the truth. Well, he didn't. He lied through his teeth. And he sat there and told us that they were not shipping weapons to Iran, they were shipping oil drilling equipment. And that was a lie. And that's unforgivable. How you train people not to do that is difficult, because they're if you don't come equipped with a basic set of values, like Conrad's moral ballast, you've got to overcome that. Training has to be better. we don't do a very good job of training, in my judgment. We have to do more. We have to do more of it. We have to do a better job. I must say that the Army, after Vietnam, reinvented itself, and it did so. There have been a couple books written about this that are really quite interesting. The Army went back to look at basic values, ethics. Who are we? What are we? What are our values? What are those things that we put up on the wall that we say to ourselves that we are? And they did deal with things like integrity and honesty. And I think the CIA needs to go through some of that, and there's serious talk about doing more of that in our training, not only for the officers as they come on to active duty, but throughout their careers. You are correct, man. We need to do a better job of that.